right, so having just watched the Ken Wilber Rebel Wisdom talk where he discusses Jordan Peterson and looking at the way that Jordan Peterson reviews myth, Ken Wilber necessarily distinguishes what he thinks Jordan Peterson understands, which is not the literal understanding of those previous mythologies, but that Jordan Peterson knows those aren't true, but looks at the mythological value of them. And Ken Wilber distinguishes that from the authors back then of Genesis, of the stories as they were written, claiming that those people actually believed those stories. And my problem with that is that I don't think it's that simple. And I think that framing it that simply actually fuels some form of arrogance in us. So I would actually put the question back to Ken. So what do you think future generations will look back on and looking at your writings and will claim, now this Ken Wilber guy, when he wrote this down, he actually believed X was the case. He actually believed there were 4 quadrants in this spiral of development in 2 tiers. He actually believed that. We now know that that's just a metaphorical sense of what happens. And really, we can talk about it from this mythological perspective and how we integrate that within our development. But when we do, we have to remember that Ken Wilber actually believed those things were literally true. There's something humbling, some bit of humility in actually acknowledging that in the same way that Ken may defend right now, well, no, I don't actually literally think that there are some things. I know that there's some distinction, but there's some way that he believes that deeply, enough to defend it, enough to make a video about it, just as I'm making a video here. And even though there's some sense that, yes, even this is a partial view, in the same way that Ken would argue that no view can be completely wrong, no view can be completely right. This isn't a criticism of Ken. The reason for me bringing this up is the fact that Ken doesn't actually look at this level and hold his views loosely reinforces the notion that this is the notion, it's not his claim, but the notion that he has finally come up with the ultimate true reality. Now we finally see the real reality. We have woken up. We're no longer dreaming in the matrix. We can see what it is that reality is, and this is it. And I would recommend that you go back and watch the movie that I'll put in the notes here about You Don't Know How Wrong You Actually Are, which looks at Aristotle and Newton and Einstein and all of the scientists who've ever claimed anything, and the best scientists, the best philosophers, the best theologians and mystics of all time, and they get stuff right and they get stuff wrong. It's partial, and it's partial based in part on what they're capable of understanding at the moment, and in part what we're capable of understanding. there's I'm mixed about this, about actually pointing this out. I'm mixed about it because some people will hear this and say, well, if we never really can know any of the truth, then why even bother trying? There are other people who will hear it and say, yeah, that is true. I know that we can never really know everything, and it is still worth trying, but don't take anything too seriously. And I don't think it's a matter of either of those being true out of context. They're always true within a context. And the context is always a mixture. It's always a combination of what's going on for you personally, developmentally, in your life story at this moment, and what's happening in the culture right now in this moment. It's a combination of those two things. So there really is no way that you can fully reconstitute what it is that I mean when I'm saying this, because you're not me, even though you're in the same culture as me. And in the future, the culture won't even be the same. So they'll even have a more challenging way to fully reconstitute this context. And yet they'll have a new context built on top of it. It will be new and fresh. And all of that is, that's just the way that it goes. It's not, I don't have a sense of despair, I have a sense of freedom with that. And ironically, I still have a sense of frustration about it too. Like, it does matter what your actual differences are. So, the phases of growth. So, I want to look a little bit at what Ken talks about regarding growth hierarchies versus dominator hierarchies. And growth hierarchies are good, and dominator hierarchies are bad. And that's clearly, that's a poor framing of those two things. Growth hierarchies are that expression of development when we're first coming into a new niche, first entering a new developmental stage and growing into that space. And we burst into that with vigor, it's a supernova of new activity, new energy and matter being formed and growing in all kinds of different directions. Then a series of integrations and maturations and connections and, okay, now let's stabilize this, is all good. And then eventually we outgrow that maturation. That becomes stagnant and has to die just like our bodies die. We go through multiple deaths, similar to the way that in Inside Out, the movie, the Pixar animated movie, the children's movie, which shows Riley going through puberty. And the models that she uses to understand life that were developed in childhood are no longer sufficiently complex to understand adulthood or this new phase of growth. And so they have to die. Silly Town and Familyville and all of the younger notions which served her well during her growing up are perfectly healthy for who she had been, are no longer healthy for who she needs to become. And so they necessarily collapse and fall apart and fall into the dustbin, not even the dustbin, the compost pile, to be reintegrated into the next phase. And so the dominator hierarchy, Joy is actually representing the dominator hierarchy in that. She is dominating. She's saying, sadness, you cannot express yourself because it's detrimental to all that I know is true, which is that the world is good. And sadness actually can't help herself, right? She has to touch the memories, which results in the collapse of everything that she knew. The despair that is, I'm not enough as I am, which triggers the collapse of who I am and gives birth to the new who I will become. But that dominator hierarchy is the dying of one growth thing. It is natural. I mean, it's kind of like saying, oh yes, when a snake gets a new skin, that's a good thing. But when it sheds its old skin, that's a bad thing. We shouldn't, we don't like that. Nobody likes it. Well, it's painful and it is not fun to face, but it is completely natural. This notion that death is bad on the micro scale or the macro scale is simply an illusion. It doesn't mean I welcome it. It doesn't mean it's less painful for me to go through these things. And I don't want to inoculate you or myself. I don't want to give myself a pain medicine. I actually want to fully experience the transition. I will get most out of, I will be able to integrate, complete more of that material which has fallen away if I actually am transparent and face it honestly. I actually will be able to compost more of my failure if I don't try to bury it too deep, but let it decay on its own and let the matter of it become my new self. What I think is particularly unique about this moment, right now, 2019, March 1st, spring, is it feels like we're facing this moment with a lot more realization than we ever have before. And we could say this is always true, but there is something very distinct. As an example, the sense that we would ever have to worry about Holocaust type events, hatred and pogroms and rounding up people, extermination, that we would ever have to worry about that again seemed unthinkable 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. 2 years ago, we're suddenly thinking, oh my God, I think we might actually have to worry about this again. How did we get back here? With all of the vows of never again, how did we end up here? Something is changing. We are in a moment right now. And I think we're in a moment of collective growth, where individually it's time to compost much of who we thought we were and who we're becoming. And I think the reason it's important to look at this is because I think that there's another view of this growth hierarchy versus dominator hierarchy, which is our global economy. And in a way, I have been characterizing the existing economy as an extractive economy. And this is partly based on reading the book Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus by Doug Rushkoff, and recognizing that our economy is built to grow. It's not bad actors who cause collapses and bubbles. It's the fundamental structure of the economic system itself. It is built to make the rich richer. And it's in part built because it is a growth hierarchy. And just as every maturation phase comes to an end, It doesn't, you don't get to stay a teenager forever. You have to grow up. And cultures have to grow up. And we go through these phases, and each one of them is useful. Our economy is going through a change. And what had been a growth hierarchy is now turning into a dominator hierarchy. It is now turning into Jeff Bezos gets to keep everything he makes, and everyone else has to, make do. Now, I'm going to claim that even the idea of universal basic income is an idea which is perpetuating the growth hierarchy. It's trying to lock that into place. But just as a river courses back and forth through the land, and you can attempt to dam it, you can attempt to create the channels that make that river go in the direction you want to, you can try to control it. It will eventually find a way to express itself. That's the climate change, is not so much that we're creating havoc. We're just not allowing the thing to express itself. There is a tension that builds up over time, this maturation process. Things shift. And to try to lock them in place in one point in time and saying, we know what is good for all time. What we say is true now is what will be true forever. As soon as we do that, and we won't ever give up the desire to do that, but as soon as we actually believe that's true, we can start to say what the structure of the next collapse is going to look like. It's going to be that thing. It's going to be, what are the forces, what's the pent-up forces that try to be expressed that are being restricted that will eventually cause that to break apart. So part of why I think that this is important to look at right now is that I think a different model of economy is necessary in order for us to fulfill our obligation to hold the systems around us accountable. Right now, we really can't. It's not realistic to think that we can just not buy things in plastic. I have friends who do, Chris. I have friends who do actually avoid buying things in plastic, if at all possible. And, but even that it's a valiant act of courageous, conscious will, and it doesn't solve the problem. If you're buying meat, a lot of that meat is grown in ways that aren't sustainable and not friendly to, they're not good. And I can't simply abstain from the things that, here's what I mean. I can't simply vote by abstaining from participating. And I can't just ignore it by saying, well, what can I do about it? So there needs to be a new system, but what does that system look like? It is too big for any of us to consider. And it's too big for all of us to agree on. The change is too big a change for all of us to agree on in the details. But in the process, I think that we can actually, and how we go about doing this, I think we can see more of what that looks like. It's something similar to the way that Uber and Lyft have disrupted the taxi industry, the transportation industry. Rather than saying, we control, some dispatcher and headquarters controls which taxi gets the next ride. We say, let the taxi drivers and the customers figure that out. There's enough of communications infrastructure that they can work that out themselves. But then they look at it and say, but we'll control the infrastructure and the profits for that. That's the growth dominator hierarchy, right? That's what it actually is merged now into, a growth dominator hierarchy. And the maturation is, no, economically too, not simply coordination-wise, but actually economically, people should be able to act as independent agents with some form of a higher degree of permeability between organizations. There will be, I guarantee there will be people who listen to this and say it's ludicrous. I'm talking about socialism or communism. I'm not talking about any of that. And it's not capitalism either. It's something new. We haven't actually seen it exist before. It's not talking about going back to something. It's talking about doing something new. And for all of those who are dead set against socialism, part of I don't even want to go here. I'll say, in some way, the existing corporation, rather than socialism being administered by the government, it's administered by the corporation. If we move forward, Jeff Bezos' view of universal basic income is something like corporate socialism. You just simply, I will make all the decisions. I know what's best. I will dictate all this stuff. I'll get my yachts and my dick pics. And you just settle for cheap merchandise. And we'll figure out how to make it so that you can afford that cheap merchandise with the universal basic income. That's not a good answer either. And I want you to each be independent, sovereign beings collaborating and cooperating with each other. Not from some enforced cooperation, but actual self-motivated, mutually beneficial cooperation for what that means in your neighborhood, locally, with you in your local context, in some global context, right? Not some universally informed brand where you have to wear your sleeves out to here, but you can wear this. You can have your hair look like this. Live where you need to live. Do what you need to do. Cooperate. Look at the decisions as you go. Don't simply say, we put it in contract, it's locked into place. We now know the bounds of it, and the letter is true and affirmed and will live forever. Like I said, that's sure certainty that it will die eventually. There are some notions, there's a book that talks about corporations die, but cities don't. In part, this is the thing that we're talking about, right? As soon as you dam a body of water, you kill it. It has to flow. It actually has to do something. If you completely control what enters your body in a sterile way, you're going to kill your body. It has to be this vibrant ecosystem of competing and cooperating notions, both within your body, listen to it. It actually is telling you, ferment, pay attention to your gut biome, pay attention to your intellectual streams. Don't simply try to say, I want to sterilize it and lock all that out and let this in. That attempting to strictly label bad and good and only have the good and leave out all the bad that's the evil part. This is a messy video, and I'm kind of curious. We'll actually post it. But there's something important about asking these questions and looking to see, is there a way for me to notice what mythologies am I living with right now that I will look back on and say, what was I thinking? How could I actually believe that was literally true? And as you're listening to this, if you're tempted to write in the comments, yes, stupid idiot, pay attention to, just look in the mirror and see what it is for you. Make fun of me all you want, but try to make fun of yourself as well. Thanks.